Good morning. I am Daniela Puente, CHCI Health Postgraduate Fellow, and I am honored to welcome you today for a critical discussion with Latino Americans on gun safety session. Gun violence through the lens of public health urges us to dig deeper in our search for pathways to safer communities. Latinos like us necesitamos estar presentes en las discusiones sobre estos temas. As we honor the accomplishments of the Latino leaders who came before us, we must stand firm in our commitment to build a safer future for the leaders that will follow. On behalf of CHCI, I would like to thank Everytown for Gun Safety for their generous support of this session. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Rafael Bernal. Rafael is a staff writer at The Hill. He covers the Hispanic political world and the policy issues around it, and global migration. He is a regular contributor to various radio and TV outlets in both English and Spanish. Rafael was previously the managing editor at UPI and practiced law in his native Mexico City. Please welcome Rafael Bernal.
Thank you, Daniela. I want to start with a small confession. This is the first time I've been nervous on a panel for a very long time, and the reason behind that, as you all know, is this is an incredibly difficult topic. 1 out of 5 people in this country have personally experienced gun violence or know someone who has. Latinos are twice as likely as their white counterparts to have experienced gun violence. These discussions can be difficult. They're basically built on trigger warnings. If anyone during this conversation feels uncomfortable, needs a little time to themselves, feel free, stand up, go outside, take a breather. We'll be here. And I want to thank CHCI for addressing this issue and for putting together such a thoughtful panel. This is obviously an issue with a lot of dead ends, a lot of policy dead ends. It's a very big unresolved issue in American politics, and that's why we have a community panel today. We are going to learn about and talk about how our community deals with this issue and what our community can do on this issue. So let me introduce our panel. We have Xochitl Oseguera. She is the Vice President of Mamás con Poder. Next, Jose Alfaro. He is the Latinx Leadership and Engagement. He's the Director of Latinx Leadership and Engagement at Everytown for Gun Safety. Miguel Avila. He is the Relocation Coordinator for Youth Alive out in Oakland, California. And Kimberly Gutierrez. She's Director of the State Advocacy Community Justice Action Fund. So with that, I think, Xochitl, since this is a community talk, let's start taking the temperature. Mamás con Poder, how are Latina mothers communicating about this issue? How do they feel generally about gun safety?
Thank you for having me today, and thank you, Hala, for organizing this panel. Moms Rising and Mamás con Poder, we are an organization of over 1 million members across the country. Mamás con Poder is our Latinx arm program and campaign, and we hear from Latina moms every day. We know that gun control and gun violence is a top priority in our communities. Gun violence prevention and gun control is always a topic when we go into communities everywhere, including places like Green Bay, Wisconsin, Michigan, where you might think, well, immigration is a top priority, or the economy, or no. It is very much an everyday issue for mothers. We are exhausted. We worry about every day sending our children to school, not knowing if they're gonna come back. Latinos in the US are dying from gun violence every day at an alarming rate. More than 4,700 Latinos die from gun violence. It is about 13 preventable deaths per day. One mom told me, we don't go out to the grocery store together with my husband. We take turns. One always stays with the children in case we get killed. Someone stays with the children. Gun violence is now the leading death of children age 19 and up 19. And 12 children are dying from firearms daily. These are your children, my children. Latino students are projected to represent 1/3 of K-12 students by 2030. 1/3 of K-12 students. And they're growing up with lockdowns, mass shootings, active shooting drills. It is terrible. Moms know that more guns don't keep us safe. There are already 400 million guns in circulation in this country. That's not keeping us safe. So what we hear all over the country is also what the statistics say. A recent poll of Latino voters conducted by Unidos and Mi Familia Vota in 2022 shows that addressing gun violence is among the two most important issues for Latinos. And Latinos strongly support policies to address gun violence. So this is a national emergency. Numbers, stories. And if you learn something in a Latino household, is listen to your mom. She's always right, even when she's not.
Definitely. That last piece of advice, you have to follow it. So, Jose, looking at your job title, I was thinking, as Latinos, we always want to be represented, whether it's a Hispanic caucus or the White House Office of Latino Engagement, or lowering it down like Latino content on Netflix. We always want to be represented. But it's a little terrifying to me, more than a little terrifying to me, that every town for gun safety needs a Latinx engagement director. When you go to work, what is the distinction between the work that you specifically focus on and the work that the organization as a whole does?
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. All right. My name is Jose Alfaro. I'm the Director of Latinx Leadership and Engagement at Everytown for Gun Safety. Everytown is the nation's largest gun violence prevention organization, and I lead all of our Latinx work. And what that means is that, the organization is taking a stance on our communities. They are investing in our communities because our communities are disproportionately impacted. For the most part, we have thought about the ways that our communities show up and are impacted by gun violence. We recently did a listening tour across the United States in over 11 cities and 7 states, where we got a better understanding of what gun violence means for our communities. Because oftentimes when we think about mass policy, when we think about the ways that policy shows up at the federal level, we have these broad and overarching policies that sometimes aren't translated into what we need in our communities. We also recognize that our communities aren't the same people, right? Mexican American communities, be it Central American communities, be it Caribbean communities, and then also depending on the region that you're from, you also have all of these distinct differences. LA Latinos aren't the same as New York Latinos, aren't the same as Miami Latinos, et cetera, et cetera. And we also have to remember that our communities are also rural and they're in suburbs. And so we really like to think about how gun violence impacts each and every one of our communities in the ways that are distinct to them. And so when I think about my experience as a Central American whose family fled El Salvador, we have a different relationship to guns and gun violence than when I think about vaquero culture or rancher culture along the Southwest. And these are some of the distinctions that we have to be mindful of in the ways that we're thinking about both policy and engagement.
Hey, Miguel, you're ingrained in a community that suffers disproportionate. We use this word disproportionately too much with the Latino community. We always have a disproportionate lack of this or disproportionate excess of that. Among all these social and structural issues that we have to deal with, whether it's food desert or lack of health care or bad education, or how does gun safety and gun violence sort of weave itself into that community, into that picture?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Well, good morning to you all. Thank you for that question, Rafael. I think that I would add to what Jose was saying. I think it's really acknowledging, right, the distinctions, within the Latino community, right? In contrast to Jose, right, I was born in Mexico. My family's from Mexico, from Guadalajara. Growing up, right, for me in California, undocumented meant something very different, to somebody in New York that was Puerto Rican, for example, right? So I think it's really acknowledging those distinctions, right, within our community, right, providing some context, right? But I think that in Oakland, and I think that's where we settled, where I grew, right? It was a community, a Black and brown community, right? Historically Black and brown community, right? The home of the Panthers, right? Brown Berets, right? So we had that history growing up. However, we still, right, had other issues, right, in our community, whether it be incarceration, drugs, gangs, right, you name it. And I think that it's really acknowledging the ways in which all of those things influence, right, gun violence, right, and they kind of all work together, and they play a part, and I think that it's really acknowledging, right, the root causes of gun violence in our communities, right. So I think, that's really what we do at Youth Alive in Oakland, California, is really acknowledge, right, the root causes of gun violence in our community.
Excellent. And Kim, well, back to this word, disproportionate. We have a disproportionate lack of healthcare access. Again, we have a disproportionate access to gun violence. How, in the Latino community, how does it play out to see gun violence as a healthcare issue?
Hi everyone, I'm Kim Gutierrez, and I, to answer your question, was born and raised in Inglewood, California, where too soon as a child I grew up understanding and seeing the disproportionate impacts of gun violence. So much so that in my community it was second nature to see that. You were immune. It was normal to come back to school and see an empty chair and know why. And so growing accustomed to that, there's something off, right? And it wasn't until I was introduced to the gun violence prevention movement, until joining Community Justice, that I realized that there is an active movement and active organizations that work tirelessly to prevent gun violence. Peacemakers that look like me and members of my community that have been on the streets, housing phone calls, intervening in conflicts that, like we know, are preventable. And so when I think about how necessary it is for more of our community across the country, especially Latino community, to understand that work, to see it, to know where to access it, to know that it's being funded and supported by their city, by their states, by their government, right? I think that is the #1 step, right? And it has to be told in language that is understandable to us. It has to be told by the people that are doing the work, that are doing this life-saving work. And so even when we think about the public health approach to gun violence, community justice talks about this a lot and works with partners that center this. But what we're really talking about is just like how we're working through the pandemic and COVID, right? There's intervention and prevention measures that our government takes to keep us safe. Why not apply that to gun violence prevention? Mm-hmm. We know our communities are disproportionately impacted. And by that, we really mean we're dying. And so the way that we need to see our government, our elected officials, all of the things that make up our community truly take this issue to heart to promote life-saving work is really what we mean when we talk about taking a public health approach.
I want to I want to frame a little bit, and this question is going to go for all four of you. We'll start in order, I guess. The ways that our community is impacted by gun violence, there is a very broad spectrum. On one end, we have terrorist attacks like El Paso, which we share with other communities. There's Buffalo, there's Pittsburgh. There's too much of that, frankly. I think that is something that everybody across the political spectrum agrees. And it goes through crime. It goes through inter-community violence, intra-community violence, to simple gun safety at home, and including, of course, to suicide. In this broad spectrum, Xochitl, where do moms, what are moms spending more time thinking about in that spectrum of potential gun violence?
Yeah, I think, like I said, we're worried every day about sending our kids to school. We are concerned about our kids' short-term and long-term trauma from listening to the news and knowing that one day it could happen to them, to their school. We also are seeing in some places that some teachers are getting armed. Like that works. More violence. So it is a concern that we are seeing the remedy to violence being more guns. And that obviously is not going to help. Now, we know that there's a lot of hate against our community. There's a lot of hate. All these mass shootings, what they have in common is hate. And we continue getting so much rhetoric against our communities, hate and xenophobia and racism against our communities, which only goes to more violence. And so it is very stressful to be a mom in America today. And it doesn't have to be this way.
Jose, the same question, but where is advocacy concentrating its resources on that spectrum?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, to set some context, I came into the gun violence prevention movement almost 3 years ago in December. Before that, I was leading sexual and reproductive rights work at a national organization doing similar organizing. And what I was the first Latino doing this particular lane of work. I didn't see other organizations focusing on our communities in the same ways that we're thinking about now. I think that our community has woken up to this space because of El Paso, Pulse, Uvalde. But the reality is also, our communities have been impacted by gun violence for generations. And why weren't they things that we were talking about, right? When we think about the gun suicide that happens in our communities, oftentimes it's pena, it's shame, it's thinking about our family members as if something was wrong with them. because we didn't have access to mental health resources, or because of the stigma of what mental health resources mean to our people and communities. We also think about the work that Miguel is doing with violence intervention and interruption. When I came into this space, what I heard was that there weren't Latinx-led organizations that were doing that work. And since I've been touring the country, we've identified over 10 or 11 organizations doing this work alone. And so, you know, one, this movement is relatively young. Two, the people who have been doing this work for generations are here and have been here. And I think that there's a way that sometimes we internalize violence that happens in inner cities because of the stigma that comes with living in poverty, or because of the stigma that comes with being members of marginalized communities. And so we really need to examine and think about why we're not thinking about violence intervention and interruption, why we're not thinking about the suicide prevention work that needs to happen. We're also not thinking about police violence in our communities in the ways that we could and should. Latinx communities are impacted by police violence. There's a group of sisters in the Bay right now, the Monterrosa sisters, asking for justice for their brother because he was shot and killed by Vallejo police officers, 3 years ago. And this officer was just brought back into the workforce. And this is a person who was known to shoot and kill young people. And so as we think about all of these dynamics, we can't just think about some of the mass shootings that have happened in our communities, because they are tragic and they very much are impactful, but we're dying each and every day. And that's not something that we should accept as well.
And Miguel, I think at that point, that we're dying each and every day. I want to really zoom in to Oakland. What element of gun violence, what part of this, again, the spectrum, what has a bigger community cost? What keeps kids from going out to the playground and practicing sports, people from attempting a new business, people from taking a walk in the evening?
I think that I'll also go ahead and provide some context, right? So Youth Alive is an organization that's been around for over 30 years, right? And over 30 years, what we've learned to work best is to take a holistic approach to gun violence, right? It's understanding that. Thank you. It's understanding, right, that violence, right, operates at multiple levels in different stages, right? Hence our focus in prevention and intervention, right? Trying to prevent, right, violence from happening. One of the ways that we look at gun violence in Oakland is similar to COVID, right? As a disease, an infectious disease that spreads, right? And really supporting, right, our programs that are doing the prevention work. However, we can't always stop a shooting, right, from happening. Over the past year, we've mediated over 250 conflicts, potential conflicts, right, that did not result in shootings and homicides, right? In a city with a population of approximately 400,000 residents, right? So I think that what we've learned, right, over the years, right, and I think that I have to acknowledge and shout out, right, the veterans that have been doing this work, right, those that have been directly impacted by this work. Our staff is, composed of individuals that have lived experience, that have directly been shot, that have lost multiple sons, daughters, right? So this is an issue that's very personal, right? It's something that for us, right, is not a dead end, right? I think that we understand that it will always be community for community, right? And as long as we continue, right, to advocate and push, right, and garner that support, from anybody that's willing to support, we're in solidarity and in community.
Kim, on that point, it's not a dead end. There's also gun violence in the home and accidental gun violence, and and of course the issue of suicide and accessibility to guns, making that possible. Is gun safety sort of the policy arena to address those mental health and at home and family issues, or is there another angle that is more effective in improving those conditions?
So I love the question, because when you ask that, it asks us to hone in on one policy when really what our community needs is wraparound services and resources. So again, like the public health approach to gun violence is taking all of these different root causes that lead us to die and to normalize this death, to actually treat that, to provide for our community, for it to sustain itself, and for it to thrive, right? And so it is gun safety, but it's also access to healthcare. It's also access to healthcare, making sure that family income is high enough for the family to be able to feed and provide for itself. All of these other things that our communities are constantly grappling with and making tough decisions on how to survive, where we're not pushing and thinking beyond to just make sure that our communities are properly thriving, right? And so I think, especially in our role as advocates and as my team at Community Justice, our role is to wrap our arms around organizations like Youth Alive that are doing this life-saving work, that are intervening in conflicts or helping prevent those conflicts, and making sure that more of our elected officials, more of our community knows what this program is, what it does, and why it's worth continuing to invest in, because it's part of the large amount of policy reform that we need to see. And I would argue that it's not a dead-end policy, right? Like, resources need to be invested, and we can push and agitate at the budget level and at the state level to make sure that that's happening. And that work doesn't stop, right? Cities have to push out budgets every year. States have to do the same thing. And so this is, obviously, I'm saying it's my commitment and Community Justice's commitment to continue agitating and being those voices and those advocates, but it's also my invitation to each and every one of you. Because, again, we're going to continue this, but I think, like Jose said and like Miguel pointed out, these programs exist across the country. And so more folks need to know about it, more folks need to be asking questions about it, and supporting us on the front lines as we're screaming and shouting and pushing for these investments to be made.
One announcement for the audience. In about 10 minutes, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. There's a microphone in the back, so start preparing your questions. And the other thing I want to...
Miguel has something to say.
If I can briefly interject, and one of the things that I would also ask you all, right, is on the back end, right, what is the cost of an individual that is shot, right, in your city, right? So I think that that's something that we often don't hear about, right? What is the cost, right? So I leave that question to you all.
Sorry, I stepped on your comment, Miguel, but I want to point something out that both Miguel and Kim have corrected me, saying that this is not a dead-end policy arena. The view from Washington is usually it is a dead-end policy arena because the conversation tends to begin and end at the Second Amendment, at federal gun policy, at the most conflictive level of our politics. So, following up on Kim's point, Xochitl, what is, from a family perspective, if not the low-hanging fruit, the possible policy advocacy, the possible change to improve gun safety in our community?
Yeah, first of all, we need to really be advocating more at a state level. There are policies that are advancing at state level, which is very important. Second of all, we absolutely need a ban on assault weapons. Yesterday. We need more resources in community organizations like Miguel's. And we need to not normalize. So there is a policy and cultural component. They have to go together.
So you touch on that cultural component a little bit. I'd like you to expand on that. Urban, rural, definitely different views of what a gun is and what a gun is for. Culturally, the Southwest versus urban areas versus New York. It's very it's a very different conversation to explain why you would need a gun in New York than why you would need a gun in Utah. How do you deal with those differences?
Yeah. So, I think first and foremost, I want to say that, like, when we did our listening tour, our main finding was that gun violence is at the tail end of bad policy decisions and solutions, systemic inequities and neglect. And so there are a range of policies that could help to prevent gun violence in our communities right now. And that's everything from access to childcare, access to mental health services, access to housing. Gentrification has been a really interesting driver of violence in our communities as well. Immigration and undocumented people don't have they're more at risk of being victims of gun violence because of the lack of reporting or their inability to report. And we also have a lack of trust in police officers and the criminal justice system. And so all of these kind of policy positions create a world where violence can thrive. And so it's a number of different policy issues, particularly in Black and brown communities, that will help to curb gun violence. When we think about some of the distinctions between rural communities, urban communities, I think gun safety is one of those conversations, right? When we think about responsible gun ownership, we're not trying to take anybody's guns away. If you own a gun, then lock your gun up, right? If you are, using it for hunting, or if you're using it for recreational purposes, be mindful of like where your gun is, where it's stored. Guns get stolen out of cars all the time, and they get trafficked into other states, other cities, internationally. We're not going to talk about international gun trafficking.
That is an issue.
But these are things that both culturally we can have conversations about, because we can have those conversations in some of these communities where having guns and having conversations about guns is normal. However, we also have to be mindful that in urban areas, if you talk about a gun, or if you talk about or ask somebody if they have a gun, that may be a risk factor for them. That may put their life in danger. And so we really have to be mindful about some of these nuances. And then finally, what I'll say is, recently the ATF ruling came out. And what it is that under the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first kind of landmark legislation in over 30 years on guns, allows for the ATF to make clear distinctions on who is able to sell guns. And why that's important is because that when you go into a gun show, you can purchase a gun from a licensed gun manufacturer, or licensed gun seller, or you can also get a gun online without having to go through a background check. And that allows for people to bypass background checks, leaving our communities that much more vulnerable to potential attacks, trafficking, and otherwise.
So, please, Kim.
One more thing, sorry. So obviously, I think to your question about policy that works, I've talked about budget investments at the city level and at the state level. But imagine how something as simple as a resolution at the state level acknowledging gun violence as a public health crisis would level the conversation so that we could start talking across the aisle about how we're going to address this as a public health crisis and what our communities need to feel supported. I think that's a level of policy that, one, we've seen enacted at the state level. It's been proposed by Senator Cesar Blanco in Texas, and it would mean so much to a state like Texas, right, to start the conversation of the public health crisis of gun violence, and not only start those conversations across the aisle, but also respond to our communities dying, respond to the need and say, hey, we acknowledge this and we're working towards solutions that work and working towards solutions that save lives.
Miguel, of all these policy prescriptions, is there one or many that stand out to you that you see as the potential for short-term relief in the community?
I think as a member of the advocacy committee, right, within Youth Alive, right, and Youth Alive, right, leading or shall I say, our policy director, Gabriel Garcia, right, is really spearheading, right, that policy work, right? Of course, doing that, right, by being informed, right, of those community members that are most impacted, right? So I think that I can't necessarily say there's a specific policy, but I can say that policy is crucial, policy and advocacy is crucial, right, in ending the cycle of violence and creating, safe and healthy communities.
So it's a longer process. Like, there is no.
I think it's an acknowledgement, right, that there's multiple battles, right, to be fought. I think that there are definitely those policy battles, right. I think that the Safer Communities Act, right, that Jose mentioned, right, was a huge victory, right, $250 million, right, and we've yet to see, right, how that really is gonna, right, trickle into our programs and many communities, right, across the states.
Yeah. I think we need to acknowledge that, of course, this panel is focused on the Latino community and its engagement with gun violence. It is not a pro-gun or anti-gun panel. But, of course, there's a very broad political position that is not represented here. That is important to say, but in view of that, and I want to ask all four of you, jump in, because it's such an intrinsic issue to politics in the United States, at what point does a gun stop being a tool and become a weapon?
I'll think about it. I'll let Jose go first.
And frankly, feel free to push back. Does that distinction matter in this conversation?
Yeah.
So I think when we think about guns as tools, right, there are people that use guns for tools all the time, right, in rural communities and other spaces. When you pick up a gun and kill somebody, that's when you pick up a gun and hurt somebody, when you pick up a gun and threaten somebody. Those are all tools for violence, intimidation, and that's not what we're talking about here, right? And so ultimately, I also think about the reality that, like, assault weapons bans should be in place, because that is not a tool that is necessary for hunting or other things that allow for humans to live and survive in a particular environment and community. It's a weapon of war and mass destruction. It is a tool for war that shouldn't be out in our streets. And people who, especially people who are either at risk to themselves or others, shouldn't be allowed to have them, but we shouldn't have them in general.
So to your point, I don't think that the distinction matters because of because it takes the focus away from the folks that are actually harmed, right? I think about all of those children in our communities that die on an every day, every week, and that's normalized, right? That's where we should be starting and focusing our resources and attention to, is how are we going to continue to preserve and save those lives to thrive, and not necessarily the semantics of when a gun becomes a tool or a resource. Because at the end of the day, at the heart of hearts, right, we've seen and talked to and organized so many families that maybe gun owners may not be gun owners, but only care about their children's lives being safe, right? Only care about living in a community where they can thrive and live and feel confident in their decisions. And so starting the policy conversation and our change making from that angle, I think is where we need to dedicate our resources, our attention, and keep the drum going when it comes to our gun violence specifically in our communities.
Thank you, Kim. I think that there's also another reality, right, to that, and I think that that is the reality that even if, right, we do, ban assault rifles, right, right, I think that folks are creative, right, and use technology, right, to their advantage, right? So in Oakland, right, we have an issue, in not just in Oakland, but in California, I'm sure many other states, right? This issue of ghost guns, right? So it's like using technology, right, to 3D print a weapon, right, that cannot be traced, that cannot be tracked, right? So I think that the way that I look at it, right, is like folks will continue, right, to use technology to their advantage, right? How can we, right, prevent or kind of dissuade, right, individuals from even having the need, right, to 3D print a weapon or get their hands on a weapon, right? I think it's really, right, in investing, right, in education and access to mental health resources, right, and all of those things that you know are crucial in the development of, you know, our community members, right, in feeling safe and wanting to live in a healthy community.
Thank you for that answer, because you stepped right into the reason why I took that dangerous turn at the federal gun policy, which we're not talking about today. And the reason is I want to ask you, open question, what are the lessons from the Latino communities, from all the different Latino communities around the country, experience with gun violence? Again, disproportionate experience with gun violence. What are the lessons that can be elevated into that difficult federal conversation?
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think, you know, there are a couple of things, right? It's really looking at some of the ways that our policies are discriminatory and those practices, again, that I was talking about earlier, whether it's access to housing, access to mental health resources, access to food, access to childcare, access to so many different things that our communities don't get access to, one, because they are actively taken away from our communities, or because they don't have access to it via language, or because they have a status that currently doesn't allow them to qualify or be eligible for a particular program, et cetera, et cetera. And I also think about the ways that, like, some of our community members are using culturally relevant healing practices, whether it's círculos or danza or ceremonia, in ways that allow them to come back to their indigenous communities or their indigenous heritages or their cultural heritages, that allow them to see themselves in a community that holds itself and each other and keeps them safe. Thinking about how we can elevate some of that at the federal level as well. And then also thinking about, you know, I'll leave it there.
I can say about domestic violence, right? It's a very important issue in our communities, and how undocumented immigrants might not be able to report or might not want to report violence because of the fear of being, and how we leave our countries because of violence and domestic violence, and we encounter domestic violence and violence in this country. And so it is important to recognize that a lot of this domestic violence, a lot of these killings are, you know, they're not with a knife, they're with a gun. And so we need to talk about that, and we need to have resources for our women and men who are going through domestic violence to really report this without the fear of being deported.
I think, Miguel, you had something, and then I see we're going to have a question from the audience.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, right? I think at the federal level, right, I would ask, right, if, you know, folks have the credibility, right, if they have the trust, right, do they speak the same language as the Latino community, right? I think that these are questions that come up for me, right, because I think that in Oakland, that's what we see that's working, right, that we have the credibility, that we are trusted, that we, you know, speak Spanish, and we, you know, we also, right, you know, are currently living in that community, right? So I think that there's that I would just add to everything that's already been said.
Okay. Question from the audience? Yeah, if you have a question, go right up to the mic. I see. Yeah.
Mayra Alvarado, California Teachers Association, and actually a 5th grade teacher in Oakland. So just a quick anecdote, in one of our high schools, you might have heard, Miguel, recently that there was a shooting, right, between 2 students because I think we focus this conversation on gun violence really a lot on like buying a gun legally and da-da-da-da, but sometimes these guns, we don't know where they're coming from, and people who legally don't have or shouldn't have access to it have it, right? And so I think you touched on this a little bit, a few of you did, but I want to hear from you. As a teacher, I want to know, right, what kind of resources do we need to be truly pushing for, like concrete resources to prevent gun violence in our schools? Like more than just in general mental health support, but like exactly what kind of supports are needed in our communities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And shout out to you, to all my educators, in the room.
Yes.
I jumped into the field of education coming fresh out of college, and I was doing restorative justice work, right? Just shout out to my educators in Oakland and everywhere really, And I think that this issue of violence in schools specifically, right? You mentioned one incident. However, over the past year, we've had multiple incidents, right? Multiple shootings, right? And the scary part is that these are middle school kids, right? That they're getting younger, right? Having access to these weapons, and I think that for us in Oakland, right, is continue to apply pressure, right? In regards to funding for our schools, right? Paying our teachers more, right? That are doing also this life-saving work, right? And also increasing, right, programs, that are doing some of this prevention and intervention work, right? So at the moment, we have a program that's called Teens on Target, right, that operates in, I want to say, about 9 different high schools and middle schools, right? So our focus right now is to continue to expand, right, those programs, that are providing that political education to high schoolers, middle schoolers, but we also have violence interrupters, right, in some of these schools. And our violence interrupters are credible messengers, right, that are from these communities that have the lived experience, right, that are mediating and diffusing some of these conflicts, right, that are engaging, students, and really just showing, right, positive alternatives, right. So I hope I answered your question.
It's wonderful to see that we have an engaged audience. There's a long line. There's 10 minutes to answer. There are no short answers. We might not get to all of you. We want to hear from all of you. So, if there's any way, well, I'm going to speed it up myself.
And I think we could stick around to,
and they'll stick around to answer your questions individually, but we would love to hear you in the microphone.
Thank you so much, actually, for taking my question. My name is Gene Cochran. I'm from Synchrony Bank, out of Ohio, and Ohio's a big gun state. Everybody there has one, basically. It's kind of like Texas, just a little colder. When I have a gun, I have 2 guns, and when I brought those into my house, me and my wife had a very long discussion about why we're having them, what are we going to do with them, how we're going to keep them safe. After we had that conversation, we had a conversation with our child. We have a gun in the house. This is where it's at. I'm not going to hide it from you, but you're never getting this combination. Because I had a nice gun safe, it was biometric, it had everything. The reason I bring this part of it up is because that conversation that I had with my child is not the same kind of conversation that's probably happening in Oakland. It's a situational conversation depending on your region. And I feel like education in gun control, gun safety across the board is very lacking. And I think one of the reasons for that is because in our Hispanic community, there's no understanding. There's not enough material out there written in Spanish, or there's not enough resources out there or even cared to pick up that pamphlet to say, oh, what is gun safety about? So I guess my question to you is, at the lowest level of education about guns, do you see any opportunity for major nonprofits, companies, the government to provide that system of education for our lower communities?
Go ahead.
So every town has a program called Be Smart, and all of our resources have been transcribed into Spanish. And this is a program that talks about secure storage in your home, how to have those conversations with your children. And we're building out our Latinx specific volunteer base, and we're talking to PTAs across the United States. My belief is that this has to be a grassroots conversation because it has to be local, right? To Miguel's point, it has to be local. You have to understand the context. You have to understand, what the culture is and how and why. And so being able to develop or create or volunteer, even with our Moms Demand Action chapters or our Be Smart leads, you'll be able to build out some of that community education work by reaching out to your school board, by reaching out to your PTA council, by reaching out to your gun club, if that's a thing that you do. And that allows for there to be conversation, and it allows for there to be responsible gun ownership culture and accountability.
Please.
Hey everybody, my name is Marlene. I'm a Chicana from El Paso, Texas, so it was really refreshing to hear someone actually talk about that because it's not something that's typically brought up in terms of gun violence, so thank you. I'm like, my family shopped at that Walmart that they shot up. Anyways, so I was in academia, I'm in philanthropy now. I appreciate all the focus that y'all have had on policy because yes, we need that advocacy, yes, but one of the things I've noticed is that in academia, there's a heavy emphasis on research, but no action, right? In philanthropy or in policy, there's like, oh, this is the action, but like, where is the research, right? So in philanthropy, where I work right now, I work on the criminal justice team. Like, the issue that brown people aren't even talked about in the first place, huge problem. No funding there as well. So my question is like, how do we, or what do you all think we can do to actually bring these things together? Because we have to have the research to push the policy because they don't want the policy without the research, but that shit takes a lot of time. And then there's no funding, right? So like, how do we actually come together to bring that vision to fruition? Because right now I see them working individually, but we need to actually come together. Thank you.
Thank you. And less than 1% of the funding in the U.S. goes to women-led organizations, and only 0.13% goes to women of color. And we are doing the work on the ground. So the answer is invest in women of color-led organizations on the ground.
Let's try to make this a...
I'll add one really quick thing because we have some of our friends here, Hispanics in Philanthropy, with some of our fellows here is an organization that is trying to do some of that. They supported and funded our listening tour to be able to do some of the work that we were able to do. So
support Mamás con Poder too.
Yes.
We're going to do a lightning round, if that's possible. If your question can't be said in briefly, because a lot of questions on this topic can't, I think the panelists have kindly offered to talk with you later. So we have 5 minutes and...
Yeah, I'll make it quick. So I'm Dario Leal. I'm a CHCI intern from Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, actually. And my question would be super quick. I was going to add some context, but just for the sake of time, why would arming teachers not be a solution in the short term for the gun issue? I know there's a lot more behind that, and in the long run, it's not a viable solution. But I've seen examples in a church in Dallas. It will say, well, there was going to be an active shooter. The shooter got shot 2 people, but they got to neutralize him relatively quickly. So a genuine question, out of ignorance, why is it not a short-term solution?
Because teachers don't want to be armed. Not at all. They're there for teaching. They're there. We have a shortage of teachers already, and the last thing they want is to be armed and to be trained. They're trained to teach our kids.
Please.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Gutierrez, CHCI intern from Long Beach, California. My question is, how can we help and inform our youth, such as children from K to 5th grade, about gun violence without implementing fear in them? And I have kind of like a sub-question, because I unfortunately lost one of my own classmates from gun safety. He committed suicide just last week. So my follow-up question is, compared to older, younger adults who may not have received that help and information earlier on in their youth, how can those conversations be different, and how can we help them both?
Miguel, you want to take that one? Or?
So, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And the unfortunate part is that there's way too many of those stories happening. I myself, right, similar to you, attended my first funeral before my first quinceañera, right? It's extremely hard, and it's normalized to a point that you would need to ask a question about how you talk about it with young people, right? But I think about the programs that exist across different schools and across the country that do violence intervention work within schools, where there is a trauma-informed approach, folks have common language, and those programs, quite frankly, don't exist enough, especially in our communities that need it and see the gun violence the most. And so obviously I'm gonna encourage you to talk to my friend Miguel here, who has and is familiar with those programs. Youth Alive has those programs, especially across California. I know a couple as well, but we need more. We need more of those. And then the other thing that I would say is, it's a lesson that I learned in Texas when I was organizing. And it's unfortunate that we come to this point, but it gives me a glimmer of hope that I see so many student organizers, so many survivors of gun violence in our communities taking up the mantle and advocating for these programs to exist and asking questions just like you did about how are we going to teach our kids to address gun violence? How are we going to talk about it to the point where we're pushing for change, we're pushing for more investment so that we don't have to come back to the table and ask for this. And so I offer that to you, but I also really thank you for the question.
I'm afraid we won't actually have time for a last question, but I'll remind you, again, our panelists have very kindly offered to talk to you personally, so you'll get a direct answer. I want to thank you, four of you. And let's give them a hand. Xochitl Oseguera, Jose Alfaro, Miguel Avila, and Kimberly Gutierrez. I mentioned I was nervous when this started. I am walking out of this hopeful that there are policy options that don't get into that knot of federal of that conversation, that interminable conversation. So I really want to thank you for this valuable panel, and I want to thank this very participative audience. You have also been great. Please keep posting about the conference. It's #CHCIHHM23, and I'm amazed that I got that on the first try. And so next up is lunch, and the lunch and plenary session is Caring for the Changing Latino Family. Thank you all very much.